together with you. I didn't come with a, determined agenda of what I want to present to you. I'm not a presenter. For those of you who studied with me before know that I actually don't like teaching. I actually hate teaching. I like schmoozing. I like schmoozing with people. I like talking with people, and I like schmoozing about ideas. So what I'm going to share with you is three different topics, three different ideas just that have been going on in relation to this particular Pesach. All of us are struggling, and all of us feel challenged in different ways. And I'm going to present to you a little bit of a conversation about the Zoom conversation that's been going on a lot. And then we'll talk a little bit about how, so from a Hasidic angle, what Pesach is about. And then if we have time, I'll share with you another idea. So in terms of the Zoom, I don't know why my screen is blinking. You know what that is? Blinking.
I'm not sure.
Do you see it blinking, or is it only me?
I see it blinking. We'll just handle the technical things. I think it's maybe light shining on your screen.
Okay, better now. Okay, good.
Changes.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't know how many. I guess if people can tell me, has anybody followed the Zoom conversation to one degree or the other? Anybody? Anybody who's on the call?
You can share in the chat.
Can people speak?
Yeah, it's Karen. Most recently, I got an email last night from the rabbi at Lincoln Square Synagogue talking about how he and the rabbi from the Jewish Center were trying to find a way to do a Seder. They're talking about doing a Zoom Seder, but also the possibility of having a Seder led by somebody on the West Coast where it wouldn't actually be Chag for them. And
Right.
so I thought that was an interesting twist. It said they still hadn't worked out the details. But so it's not just these foreign Sephardic rabbis in Israel who are talking about it, but also rabbis here in the U.S.
Right. So just to pick up on what Karen said, it started with a couple of Moroccan rabbis in Israel who basically released this statement or this document in which they argued that logging onto a computer is not really that much of a problem halachically, and therefore, if anybody's alone or anybody who is having a hard time leading their seders themselves, it's okay if they log on onto a computer and have a seder through Zoom with other people. And the way the Jewish community works, as you can imagine, that was a huge backlash, a huge pushback against that, which raised one of the big questions, right? One of the big questions that Halakha still struggles with is, what's the role of technology in Halakha? And halachically, is there an issue with logging on a computer? What are the issues? What are the questions? Why would it be a problem? Why would it not be a problem? Now, I want to point out two things, and then we'll move on. Is that there was a debate years ago. There was a big debate about the status of electricity in halakha. Can one put on a light on Shabbos? What's the problem with lighting a light on Shabbos? What is the problem with activating any kind of electrical current? And for some of you, you might know, for a while there were people who believed that the problem is lighting a fire. I think early rabbis, when they saw electricity and the intensity and the heat, they assumed that somehow involved the fire. So for them, there was a question of lighting a fire. Others understood that there was no real fire involved and therefore thought there were other problems, other reasons why one should not be allowed to do it on Shabbat. Now, that was a question once upon a time. And that question has been settled. There are some people who think that it's biblically prohibited to put on a light on Shabbat. There are those who think it's only a rabbinic prohibition. There are others who think that it's more kind of a minhag thing. The problem is that today we're talking about something very different than that old conversation. We're not talking about a question whether electricity is fire or not. I don't think anybody has still that fantasy that electricity is fire in the technical sense. The problem is actually a new problem. The problem is, how do we treat technology today in terms of what's considered malacha, in terms of on Shabbat, doing work and not doing work? And that's actually new territory. That's new territory. I don't think that halacha has really had a chance to start thinking seriously about this question. I mean, this is really a conversation in its infancy, in its real basic infancy. This is all new. And halakha is going to have to answer a lot of big questions. Is writing on a computer considered writing? I mean, once upon a time when there was a prohibition about writing on Shabbat, we knew what writing means. Writing means taking a pen, a quill, dipping in ink, putting pen to paper, and put some kind of designs on the paper, whether those designs turned into letters, whether those designs turned into numbers, those designs turned into something else. We knew what writing means. Nobody writes that way. As a matter of fact, I would venture that a small segment of the population still use a pen to write. We don't write that way anymore. We write with computers. But is that writing? I mean, you're not writing. You're pushing buttons, you're clicking on buttons, but the clicking on buttons results in something on a paper. Well, not on a paper, on a screen. Is that writing? That's even an easy question. What happens if you program your Alexa to put on your stove? Alexa, put on some French fries. And Alexa activates your stove. And your stove cooks your steak. What did you do? Did you cook on Shabbat? Well, I didn't cook. I just told Alexa to put up a steak, but you did end up doing a process which result in food being cooked. So is that cooking? Is that not cooking? What happens if you have a motion sensor activated stove, for example? Right? It's set in such a way that if you move your hand on top of it, it knows how to get started. That's how you activate your oven. Is that okay? Is that a problem? Once again, I mean, you didn't cook, you just moved your hands. What's with pod keys? Some of you might be familiar. Pod keys, right, are those keys that you don't have to put into the lock. You have it in your pocket, you walk up to the lock, and then that kind of deactivates some kind of magnetic current, and then door opens. Is that okay on Shabbat? Is that not okay on Shabbat? Are you doing something? Are you not doing something? Those are all big questions that we have not yet figured out the answer for, and they all came to kind of to the fore now when we're trying to figure the Zoom question. And what we have is actually kind of, different approach. Just like I said, the rabbis in Israel, the Moroccan rabbis, very emphatically felt that it's okay to use Zoom on Pesach. I don't think they said anybody can use Zoom. I mean, they said if there's a need, if someone feels that it would be difficult to Pesach alone, then they can use Zoom. Then you have the other extreme, which is what Karen mentioned, and this is Rabbi Robinson and Rabbi Levine from the Upper West Side. They basically are not comfortable with using Zoom at all, not using Zoom at all. But they came up with a kind of interesting twist. What they decided to do is they are going to have someone on the West Coast run a Seder when on the West Coast it's not Pesach yet, but when on the East Coast it's going to be Pesach already. And what they said is people can log on before Chag arrives, people can log on and follow the Seder on the West Coast that's being led by someone for whom it's not Yom Tov yet.
Interesting.
That's very, very interesting. And we can hear you, by the way, Karen.
I finally figured it out.
Thank God. Thank God. Why interesting? What do you mean by interesting?
I would not have thought that about the time change or the time difference, rather, as being a way to honestly kind of circumvent the restrictions of, I'm here in Michigan. So
right.
Like with New York, so the circumvent the halakha, it's an interesting question whether it's okay or not.
Right.
And part of me says,
right.
Why not? Because use the time zone to your advantage. God gave us, whatever. So
right.
That would be fun.
Right. So like Karen mentioned, I mean, several Upper West Side rabbis have sent out this option. Actually, the other rabbi that Karen mentioned, Rabbi Levine, that's Rabbi Barshul, that's the shul we go to. Here is the interesting question, Dan. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are, everybody. He and I had a little bit of a back and forth about that. They only allow people to log on and then be passive absorbers of the Seder, meaning they don't allow for you to keep your side of the computer, your side of the kind of conversation open. So, in other words, you can only follow on the screen what's going on at the other end on the West Coast, but it cannot be a two-way screen, either of your images being recorded as well, and let alone not you talking back to the people on the other side. And I'm curious, what do you think? I am not so sure what I think about it. I mean, I am actually kind of a little bit in the middle in terms of I personally believe that you cannot activate a computer on Shabbat. It might actually be a biblical prohibition, which I'll explain maybe another time. But at the same time, I'm not sure, once the computer is activated, if it was activated, let's say before Shabbat, it's activated before Yom Tov, and we're doing what we're doing right now. We're all sitting in front of screens. We're talking to each other past screens. We're looking at each other and seeing each other moving around and all of that. Would that be a problem on Shabbat or Yom Tov? Let's put aside whether it feels good. It'll feel weird. I agree. But should it be unlikely problematic to do what we're doing right now? What are your thoughts? Anybody?
I'm not sure overall, but given the current circumstances of the coronavirus and having to stay separate, my feeling would be that Hashem would want us to be connecting to each other, even if it's Shabbat, that we should be able to be the Jewish people, if you will. I know Shabbat and Yom Tov are, piling on top of each other, and Shabbat is more than just a Yom Tov. But I think my feeling is he'd rather we do it together.
Right.
Because I'm going to be alone.
Right. Oh yeah, you're going to be alone by yourself.
Well, the dog will be here, but he doesn't do a lot during services.
No money out from the dog.
No.
Anybody else want to add in terms of halacha? Is there a reason halachically to argue pro or con what we're doing right now? Would that be one of the 39 prohibitions or not? Anybody else?
I have a question.
Sure.
What's the difference between doing that and, say, if there's something important you wanted to see on TV, you turn that on Friday afternoon and leave it on all Shabbat? Isn't that the same thing?
Okay, so you're saying those should be judged at the same time. Those are basically variations of the same issue. If you could do one, you cannot do the other. Here's the difference, though. I would argue a TV being on is actually far less of a problem. And again, I'm not saying it's okay or not okay. I'm just kind of trying to figure out what the issues are than what we're doing. Because in a TV, you're really a passive participant. You're doing nothing. The TV is on and you're looking at it, or you're not looking at it. My question is, in this case, what we're doing right now, could you imagine that this would fit one of the prohibited categories on Shabbat? Or, we're doing nothing. We're transmitting images, we're transmitting sounds, but is that a problem halachically or not?
It's Karen. First of all, I think we need to differentiate between Shabbat and Yom Tov.
Okay, spell that out.
Secondly, I think we should differentiate between first night and second night. So one could argue, the second night's Thursday night. One could argue that perhaps it's more permissible. It's more I don't know. It's less of a problem in some ways to do it on the second night, even though you might have to leave the computer on or turn it on or something, because they're really, do we really have a second night? Is there validity to having a second night when we know what day it is all around the world?
Right. So certainly there's a hierarchy in terms of the status of the 2 days of Yom Tov, and not the same for sure. Which, by the way, coming back to Susan's point, when someone is going to be alone and they say, 3 days alone is just unbearable for me. is there a hierarchy of when I should rather log on and when I should rather not log on? Then clearly the answer would be, as Karen said, if you have to, it's preferable that you did it the second day Yom Tov rather than the first day of Yom Tov. In other words, on Thursday night going on Friday, or anytime on Friday, because absolutely, Karen is absolutely right. There is a hierarchy even within the prohibitions. Okay, so that's one of the big questions. One of the big questions is, once the program was activated before Chag, is there a problem of having it being bidirectional, or should it only be unidirectional? Then there's the last thing I want to talk about, and then we'll move on to another topic, is that there's this middle ground. The middle ground is Rav Schechter, myself, Rav Yoni Rosenzweig in Israel, who basically said as follows. If it's a problem, if it's just a question of, you'd rather not do the Seder alone, it's just not going to be the nicest Seder, you wish you had company, that's not grounds to allow logging onto a computer. That's not grounds enough to permit logging on a computer on Yom Tov. However, if there is the chance of physical danger, and here's the big chiddush. Mental health is the same as physical health. And it is even the slightest chance that being alone for 3 days would be detrimental to a person's mental well-being, that is the same level as physical well-being, and absolutely, unequivocally, they not only are allowed, but should log on so that they're not alone. And I think what's exciting about that, for me at least, is that I think that it's pretty new. It's pretty new. For Halachah to appreciating the importance and the challenge of mental health. I think up until recently, Halachah was very much in kind of physical binary. Will you be in physical danger? Okay, sure. Then everything is pushed by the wayside. If you're not going to be in physical danger, then we have to kind of try to accommodate halakha. I think what's been nice in the last couple of years is that there's an appreciation that maybe I'm not going to be in physical danger. I'm not going to die. I'm still going to survive physically. But the mental hurt and the mental damage is just at the same place as the physical hurt. And that's number one. And number two, the bar is this low or even lower. Meaning, it's not like someone sits in their room and says, well, I'm not sure, it might be very hard for me, I might be impacted by that very, very strongly. If there's even the slight, even a whiff of perhaps the possibility of mental hurt or mental pain, then it's okay to log on. I'm seeing your face and I could tell that you're waiting to talk. You gotta unmute yourself, yes.
Well, I thought of a different thing just now. Is if the other question is is Zoom going to automatically record the session or not, or do you have to actually activate it?
And why is that relevant?
Well, I mean, if you're I thought that the idea of making a recording would be making a recording during Yom Tov would be problematic. Yeah,
I think a recording would be a problematic, but I mean, making a recording is just a secondary part. I mean, why would you want to record it?
Well, if Zoom does it automatically without telling you, or as an example.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if they do it without telling you, then it's not a problem.
Yeah. Can I add to that question? I don't understand the distinction. Why would a recording, if it's already recording it, because that's what it's doing, it's recording on the camera, it's recording it and it's putting it online. The question is, what's keeping that recording for posterity?
Posterity, yeah.
Is it going to make a file out of this, or is it going to dispose it? I don't know. With that, I don't even understand why that would be an issue or how. What would be the distinction? But I'm listening.
No. I mean, the challenge or the excitement, it depends on your perspective, is that there are no answers. I mean, we don't have answers yet. We're figuring it out as we are talking. You and I and all of us on this chat, on this group. Karen added something, Susan added something, and now the two of you are adding something, and slowly and surely we'll figure that out. I want to say one last thing before we moving on is that Like I said, it's been a very intense debate within the halachic community. Those are very much, so to speak, I mean, I'm using these terms loosely, very liberal on this issue, and there are those who are kind of very conservative on this issue. But I think that something that's important to realize and appreciate is that some of the people who are conservative on this issue are not conservative because they're halachically conservative. It's not because, they just don't like change and they're always suspicious of any form of change. Here's what people have raised, the big concern. The big concern that people have raised is that the reality is now that shul is a place that forces us to interact physically with other people. We know if we want to go to daven, we have to go to shul. If we go to shul, we meet people. If we meet people, we hang out with them, we listen to them, we get to know them, we hear what's going on with them, we can give them support, we can get support from them. If we are moving the shul into the virtual space, into cyberspace, when all of this is over, what's going to do that? What is that going to do to the notion of shul that is such an important part of our emotional and mental well-being? And that's a concern. That's a concern. I mean, that's a challenge of holding on to the two, sides of this equation, where on the one hand, you want to be immediately responsive. On the other hand, you can't lose sight that whenever the time comes, we will get out of this. And we were going to go back to our daily routines, and what would be the consequences of taking away the space and the status of public physical gathering in halacha, which for now is a positive. It forces us to meet people, to see people, to interact with people. And if it turns out that, you can actually daven on the internet, you can pray on the internet, then then why would I have to go to shul at all? And what are the consequences of that? And that's the big concern. That's a big concern. It's something to be really concerned about.
That ties together with the whole notion that most all rituals in Judaism are meant to be done with a community. And, and so going back, I think it was Judy's point. I mean, the argument could be made whether I don't think it's solely mental health reasons, but isn't it better to be with other people on a Chag and to celebrate with other people, whether it's Shabbat or Pesach, than to be alone?
Right.
So,
right.
And also if you go back to the time of when the temple was destroyed, I mean, we had to rethink what Judaism meant then too. So, I think coming out of this, or probably even before we come out of this, people are getting, now we have the phrase zoomed out. People are not so enthralled with Zoom anymore. We're doing this because we have to on some level. And so maybe there will be good things and bad things that come out of this, or there will be some things that we keep and some things that we change going forward.
Right.
I'll add one. Sorry, can I add one last thing? How I'm assuming your son right now is taking school online. How well is that working for him? Because my son's doing school online, and to say that he'd rather be at school is an understatement. And so my son really hasn't left the house in 3 weeks, and we don't have a yard really to speak of. So. The socialization for adults, and especially children, I don't think is going to be going away anytime soon.
Right. So the question is how to hold on to those two. That's a challenge. Right? The challenge is to be, like I said, immediately responsive, but also think long term. And I want to piggyback on what Karen said, actually, apropos of Pesach, which is fascinating, because the halacha is that you cannot have a Korban Pesach on your own. You should ideally do it in a group. And I think the idea actually comes from the fact that one of the symbols of freedom is the ability to congregate. When we left Egypt, when we became free people, one of the benefits of a free person, as opposed to a slave, is that they can congregate. They can create community. They can create groups. And that's the essence of Korban Pesach, is to kind of, acknowledge community, acknowledge the ability that we now have other people. Now, the question is, how do you do that? And going back to what was mentioned before, but what do people do who are alone? How do they create community? How are they going to be, achieving community? And I have to say one thing I have to add, and this is so fascinating about how these discussions, sometimes the details get lost. Israeli rabbis were dealing with one day being alone. right? Holiday in Israel is going to be Thursday. So for them, okay, we're talking about one day being alone. Should we allow Zoom? Should we not allow Zoom? That's not our question. Outside of Israel, we're talking about 3 days, 2 days Yom Tov plus Shabbat, being alone. And that's a different kind of question, a different kind of equation, a different kind of, variables. And that challenges the rabbis to think. And I don't think we have a good answer. I'll just add one other example that this came up is the question with praying with a minyan, praying with 10 people and saying Kaddish. Some people who need to say Kaddish, and for Kaddish you need a minyan of 10, and if it's an Orthodox context, it's a minyan of 10 men. So what do you do? How do you have minyan? Can 10 people each of let's play this out here. If we were to have 10 people on this screen, would you think that this is a minyan and therefore we can daven together and say Kaddish together and everything, or not? What would any of you think? That was a real sigh, Susan.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, if we're supposed to be physically in each other's presence, then no, it's not. But if we are, in this case, together in spirit, then yes, we are. Okay. Anybody else? What are your thoughts? I mean, if you were the rabbi and you had to make the decision whether we can daven in a minyan, would this satisfy what in your mind is what minyan is trying to accomplish, I guess? I guess that's a way to kind of ask it. And I guess another way of asking the question before I want to hear from other people is like, it goes to the fundamental first principle question, which I mentioned before, which is, what is virtual reality in the 21st century? Is virtual reality real? Are we in a group right now? I mean, I think we're in a group. This is a group of people learning together. There's 7 of us learning together. But are we in a group? And how do we decide that, right? It's a philosophical question. It's a language question. It's a psychological question. But how do you go about deciding these things? Any thoughts? What are you thinking?
It's a matter of circumstance. I mean, isn't it better that we meet this way than that we not meet at all? I mean, I think far more troubling, first of all, I grew up in an Orthodox home, but I don't consider myself Orthodox. So this is, and so I don't know that the need for a minyan is not, and I'm not male, so the need for a minyan is not as critical to me. But I think what's far worse is the fact that people who are passing away now, that they can't have, they have to have a virtual shiva, and that, that they have to be alone when they're mourning a loved one, to me is far worse than the fact that you can't pray in a physical minyan.
Right. I mean, not to compare. I mean, of course, what I'm going to mention is a good thing relative to what Karen just mentioned. But our son was bar mitzvah this past Friday, and there was this plan for having a big bar mitzvah and a party and a celebration. And instead, we ended up having a virtual bar mitzvah. Was it great? It wasn't great. Was it terrible? It wasn't terrible. It was not terrible. We had a bunch of friends on screen, and we gave speeches and we sang a little bit together. And again, it's not a real thing, but what's real today? What is real today is the big question. And I don't know the answer. The
reality of it is that he had the bar mitzvah. You had a party of sorts. If you choose to do so, when this is over, you can have a little something or a big something. Right. And the people will get together and they will celebrate in person so that you can physically get hugs and mazel tovs and everything. Right. Now it's a matter of keeping ourselves healthy, mentally, like you said, mentally, physically. It's a matter of observing however we can the process of being a bar mitzvah, of you didn't feel any, and I'm sure your parents or whoever didn't feel any less pride in their grandchild because they couldn't physically be there. Right. They'll give him a big hug afterwards, but now that's it.
Right.
So, this is important. It's
Right.
important to be with each other in any way we can. Better if we're physical, because I'd rather be at shul than by myself. But to be at a virtual Seder,
Yep.
To be at a virtual Seder, which I'm going to be, to me is important. At least I'm connecting. I will be at a virtual Seder with my brother and his family who are in Baltimore. So that we will all be able to be part of it. I can't be with them, but I will be with them, if you get me.
Of course. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of flesh it out with you. Like I said, I mean, this is still a work in progress, and it's going to take a lot of time to figure that out. Again, the legal piece, the philosophical piece, the sociological piece, and most importantly, I think that, as I tell my friends, this is an anxiety-inducing time for us and for halakha. Halakha also wants to come out looking nice and looking responsive. And halakha is just as anxious as we are, because halakha wants to be able to respond, wants to be able to offer, a way of going about it. It has its own concerns and its own worries and its own doubts. So we'll see what happens. In the last 15 minutes, I want to share one final thought and flesh it out with you, which I think is applicable to every Pesach, but is even particularly applicable to this Pesach. So I'm going to give you a little quiz. Does anybody know what is the most important piece of the Haggadah? And what I mean by the most important piece is, if you were to have limited amount of time and you would go to someone and say, Rabbi, if I can do all the Haggadah, what is the most important piece of the Haggadah that I have to say? Do you know which one is the one that encompasses the essence of the story best and most?
I used to. I used to know that. I don't know now.
Okay, anybody?
Myself. I would say it's Pesach, Matzah, and Morah.
Yep, that's correct. That's correct.
Right?
So,
Yeah.
good job, Judy.
Thanks.
So basically, towards the end of the Haggadah, and I'm going to bring it up on the screen where it comes from. It actually comes from the Talmud in Tractate Psachim. Can you see my screen now?
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to scroll down. If you see me scrolling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So if you see at the very bottom there where the arrow is, everybody see where I am?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's the Mishnah. So let's read that together, and let's think through what's going on. Rabban Gamliel Ho'omer. Rabban Gamliel used to say, Kol shelo amar shlosha dvarim elu b'pesach lo yatsa yedei chavato. If you didn't say these three things, then you did not fulfill your obligation. Ve'elu heim pesach matzah umaror. You have to say these three things, and if you did not fulfill these three things, you did not fulfill your obligation. Now, I have a question for all of you. Which obligation did you not fulfill? There is an obligation, and Rabban Gamliel comes along and tells us you don't fulfill that obligation unless if you say those things. Which obligation are you not fulfilling?
Whoa. I don't know.
I'm sorry?
I was going to say Bechol Dor Vador.
Meaning the idea that everybody has to see as if they were redeemed from Egypt. Okay. Anybody, any other suggestions? Which mitzvah, which obligation requires recitation, requires oral expression?
Well, Magid. Well, that's not a mitzvah.
So you're saying the mitzvah of telling the story, this is what you have to tell.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know, but that's a good idea.
Okay. Anybody else? Any other suggestions?
You have an idea?
When Rabban Gamliel says, if you don't say these three things, you did not fulfill the mitzvah, which mitzvah is he talking about?
Don't know.
Is it your teaching about Pesach? Is that?
Okay, so that's a variation of Magid. Okay, so let me tell you what is going on here. The Bible tells us that on Pesach we have to do three things. We have to eat the korban Pesach, we have to eat matzah, and we have to eat maror. Okay? 3 mitzvot. You have to eat Pesach, you have to eat matzah, you have to eat maror. Rabbi Gamliel comes along and tells us that the korban Pesach is not the end. The korban Pesach is the means. The matzah is the means. The maror is the means. It's a means towards an end. The end is telling a story. The end is telling the story. You do not fulfill the obligation to eat a korban Pesach when you ate, because you're thinking, okay, God wants us to eat a korban Pesach. The animal, I'll eat some meat. I did what I had to. I had a matzah. I did what I had to. I had maror. No. The matzah, the maror, and the korban Pesach are really means towards an end. And I'm not going to get into the details because he has this in the pasuk. It has the word va'amartem zevach Pesach in the context of the korban Pesach. The Torah uses the word va'amartem. You should say, which from that Rabban Gamliel infers that the primary purpose of Pesach is not the mitzvot. The primary purpose is to tell. As a matter of fact, the essence of Pesach is when God tells Moses he's going to redeem the Jews from Egypt, what's the reason he's going to redeem them? Is redeeming them. He gives one reason. Leman tesaper, I'll translate in a moment. Leman tesaper va'aznei bincha iven vincha. I'm redeeming you because I want you to have a narrative. Slave people don't have narratives. They don't have stories. They are contingents. They are not independent existence. They don't have a story. Their story is contingent on someone else's story. We are going to be free people, but God wants us to have a narrative. That's what it means to be people. And then on Pesach, we continue the narrative. And that's why you have to see yourself, is because we're not repeating last year's story. Last year's story is boring, and I know last year's story. We are saying this year, what is the new story this year? What is the narrative that I'm telling, starting with the redemption of Egypt, starting with what happened, and then going. And I feel that one of the silver linings of what's going on is that this is going to be a very fascinating chain to the narrative that we're telling ourselves. This is going to be a very unique Pesach, a Pesach that's very distinct and very different than any other Pesach that we've had before. And that will be incorporated into the story that we're telling. And we're telling, we were in Egypt, we were redeemed from Egypt, we were in Israel, we were exiled, we had, the pogroms, we had the Holocaust, and we had Israel, and we had this, and we had COVID, and we did this, and this is how we grappled with COVID and with our obligations and our responsibilities. So I think in that way, if there's a silver lining to be found in this kind of real difficulty and real challenge, is that this will add in a particular angle to the story that otherwise would have been. And I say this every year. I tell my students every year on Pesach what I said to you before. I said, you think you know the Pesach story? You don't. It's not the story you said last year, because last year was a different story. You were different. Your situation was different. Your friends were different. Your family were different. Your employment was different. Everything is different this year. And with those differences comes a different story that you're telling. And I think this year it's so all the more so true, because this year indeed is very different than all the Pesachs we've told ourselves. And I want to add one last source. I want to bring it back to screen. This is a crazy source I want to share with you. So I'll scroll down further. And this is from the Sfat Emet. Sfat Emet was a Hasidic Rabbi from Poland, a Gerach Hasidic Rabbi. I'm sorry, let me go back. One second. Okay, you see where I am, the underlined pieces? Can you see my screen? Hello?
Yes.
Yes, I see it.
Good. Okay, good. If ever there was an audacious statement in the Hasidic Sefer, and I know there are a lot of them, This is one of the most audacious statements that I can think of. There's 8 words, and let me read them for you and translate. Ki yetziat Mitzrayim yotzeh mikoach el hapoel al yedei hasipur. Anybody want to venture a guess if you're comfortable with Hebrew? What he's saying? Ki yetziat Mitzrayim yotzeh mikoach el hapoel al yedei hasipur.
I don't know.
Are you ready for this? Let me tell you what he's saying. When you sit down to the Seder and you decide that you're going to tell the story of Pesach, there is no pre-existing story that you're recounting. Pesach is not about recounting a story. Pesach is about making a story, writing a story, creating a story. Ki yetziat Mitzrayim, the redemption from Egypt, yotzeh mikoach el hapoel, only becomes actualized al yedei hasipur, through the telling. Until you tell it, that story did not exist. You're not opening a history book. You're not opening a Bible and looking, what was the story? And say, oh, here's the story the Bible tells. The Bible tells you to tell a story. When you tell the story, that's when it's happening. In other words, on Pesach night, you know where you're going to be? You're going to be a writer. You're going to be writing memoir rather than reading history book. And I think, again, this is kind of something that's really, really applicable to the way we are today, where we're writing a new story. And as we sit down at the Seder, we don't know what's going to come out of our mouth. We don't know yet what's going on here. We have no idea. But that is going to be our task tonight. Not tonight, I mean Pesach night. And I will end with one last thought, and I want to hear your thoughts. This is a thought that my rabbi shared with us, which I thought was very powerful. The Talmud talks about 2 types of Pesach. And the Talmud calls it Pesach Mitzrayim, the way Pesach was celebrated when the Jews were still in Egypt, that last time when they were in Egypt and they knew tomorrow morning they're going to be redeemed. And then the other one is called, the rabbis call Pesach Dorot, the Pesach that we have in subsequent generations. So the rabbis seem to suggest that there was once upon a time a Pesach like the one in Egypt, and ever since we have the other kind of Pesach. And what my rabbi suggested is that perhaps this year is going to be a reenactment of that Pesach, when everybody was locked up, everybody was sitting around not knowing what's coming, not knowing what's going to look like, filled with anxiety, filled with doubt, and also filled with hope. And maybe perhaps the model that we need to look at for this year's Pesach is not last year's Pesach. Of course, nobody's going to be able to replicate last year's Pesach. It's different. I mean, who can replicate Pearlstone Pesach? Nothing like it. That's we're not going to have. But we can create a new Pesach. And maybe it makes sense to draw on what happened in Egypt. That was a Pesach more similar to ours. They were locked up. There was something roaming in the streets that's frightening. They knew that this will come to an end. They tried to have as much faith as they could. And they were at the cusp of writing their narrative. And I think that's where we are this year. We are this year in a Egypt mode, where on the one hand, there's so much fear, there's so much anxiety, there's so much unknown, there's so much ambiguity. But at the same time, if we believe that Pesach is not about recounting an existing story, but Pesach is about creating a story, Pesach is about creating a narrative. And again, there are 7 people on the screen. That doesn't mean that none of us is going to be saying the same story. That means that on Pesach night, on Wednesday night, when you sit down to your Seder, whether it's alone or with someone else, you're going to say your story. Because there is no pre-existing Pesach story. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing. That's what the Sfat Emet says. Sfat Emet says, the story happens when you tell it. And your story happens when you tell it, and the next person's story happens when they tell it, and the next person's story happens when they tell it. And that's going to be the privilege, I guess, if we can see it as such, of Wednesday night, to figuring out what is the story that we're telling now, and how do we link what's going on now in terms of our own challenges, our own fears, our own doubts, our own uncertainties, how do we kind of link it up with that other story?